In 1982, a little-known cluster of islands in the South Atlantic Ocean suddenly took center stage in a fierce international conflict. The Falklands War, though short-lived, nearly ignited a much larger crisis between global powers. The opening moments were filled with tension and urgency. Images of warships slicing through rough seas, British soldiers bracing in the cold wind, and Argentine forces storming beaches flashed across screens, bringing a distant, forgotten territory into the global spotlight. The war began when Argentina, under the rule of a military dictatorship, launched a surprise invasion of the Falkland Islands, known in Argentina as the Malvinas, on April 2, 1982. They believed the time was ripe to reclaim the islands, which had been under British control since 1833 but remained a deeply emotional issue for many Argentinians. The invasion was swift and largely unopposed, catching the British government off guard. But what followed was even more astonishing. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's immediate and uncompromising decision to fight backed up Britain's response was nothing short of extraordinary. Thousands of miles from home, it mobilized one of the most complex naval and air operations since World War II, sending a task force to the South Atlantic to retake the islands. The war saw intense naval battles, harrowing air raids, and brutal ground combat, all unfolding in some of the world's harshest weather conditions. At the heart of it all was a question that went beyond geography, sovereignty, national pride, and political survival. But this was more than a regional conflict. It drew the attention of the United States, the United Nations, and Cold War powers, who feared escalation. Could a war over these isolated rocks really change the balance of global politics? The Falklands War, in just 10 weeks, left a mark on both Britain and Argentina that is still felt today. This was a war born from history, politics, and emotion, and its legacy continues to echo across the world. The Falkland Islands, a remote archipelago in the South Atlantic Ocean, lie some 300 miles off the coast of Argentina and more than 8,000 miles from the United Kingdom. Windswept, cold, and sparsely populated, these islands may seem insignificant on a map, but they've been at the heart of one of the most bitter sovereignty disputes in modern history. Their colonial past is complex, first cited by European explorers in the 16th century. Both Britain and Spain laid claim to them during the era of imperial expansion. Spain eventually withdrew, but in 1833 Britain established permanent control. Argentina, which had gained independence from Spain just years earlier, considered this a colonial theft and has since maintained that the islands, Las Malvinas, as they call them, rightfully belong to them. For nearly 150 years, British settlers lived on the islands, farming sheep and living quiet lives under a small local government. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Argentina never abandoned its claim, and successive governments made diplomatic efforts to press their case. In the 1960s and 70s, the issue was raised repeatedly at the United Nations, with calls for a negotiated solution. Despite dialogue, no lasting agreement was reached. By the early 1980s, these tensions would erupt into full-blown war. In 1982, Argentina was ruled by a brutal military junta led by General Leopoldo Galtieri. The country was suffering a severe economic crisis, soaring inflation, rising unemployment, and growing unrest on the streets. Galtieri and the junta were rapidly losing public support. Desperate to rally the nation and distract from domestic failures, the regime saw an opportunity in the Falkland Islands. They believed the British wouldn't mount a significant response, especially given the UK's shrinking military budget and recent moves to reduce its presence in the South Atlantic. Diplomacy between the two nations had faltered, and both sides were growing frustrated. Tensions at the United Nations had failed to produce any resolution. In this volatile climate, Argentina made its move. On April 2, 1982, Argentine forces launched Operation Rosario and invaded the Falklands. The landing was swift and met with minimal resistance from the small British garrison. Within hours, Argentina had taken control of the capital, Port Stanley. Back home, the invasion was met with celebrations. National pride surged as crowds filled the streets. But the reaction in Britain was the opposite: outrage, disbelief, and a demand for action. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, already under pressure from domestic unrest and economic turmoil, responded decisively. She declared that the invasion would not stand and that the islands would be retaken by force if necessary. Britain immediately began assembling a naval task force to sail the 8,000 miles to the South Atlantic. This was a monumental undertaking. Aircraft carriers like HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible were rushed into deployment, along with destroyers, frigates, transport ships, and nuclear submarines. Public support was overwhelming. The nation rallied behind the troops. Thatcher's bold stance earned her both admiration and criticism, but she stood firm. Meanwhile, last-ditch diplomatic efforts continued, primarily through the United States and the UN, but ultimately failed. As the British task force closed in on the islands, the war escalated. One of the most controversial and decisive moments came on May 2, when the British submarine HMS Conqueror torpedoed and sank the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano. Over 300 Argentine sailors were killed. Though the ship was outside a declared exclusion zone, the British justified the attack as a necessary military action. The sinking sent shockwaves through Argentina and removed the threat posed by its navy for the remainder of the war. Argentina struck back. On May 4, an Exocet missile launched from an Argentine aircraft struck the British destroyer HMS Sheffield. The ship caught fire and later sank, killing 20 sailors. It was the first British warship lost in battle since World War II. These events marked the beginning of a deadly game of cat and mouse on the high seas. Tensions rose, and each side braced for what would come next. Psychological warfare, misinformation, and media control became part of the battle. By mid-May, the British had launched an amphibious landing at San Carlos Water on the Falklands' eastern coast. The ground war had begun. The terrain was treacherous, boggy, windswept, and freezing. Yet British forces advanced, engaging in fierce combat with well-entrenched Argentine troops. One of the bloodiest battles occurred at Goose Green, where the Parachute Regiment clashed with heavy resistance. Other brutal engagements followed at Mount Longdon, Two Sisters, and Wireless Ridge. These night battles were fought with bayonets, mortars, and grenades, reminiscent of the trench warfare of earlier eras. Elite units like the Gurkhas and Royal Marines played crucial roles in breaking through enemy lines, enduring freezing temperatures and relentless artillery fire. By mid-June, British forces had surrounded Port Stanley. Argentine troops, poorly supplied and suffering from low morale, were overwhelmed. On June 14, the Argentine commander surrendered. British troops raised the Union Jack over Port Stanley, signaling the end of the conflict. The war had lasted just 10 weeks but left deep scars. In total, 649 Argentines, 255 British servicemen, and 3 Falkland Islanders died. The human cost was staggering for such a short war. Politically, the consequences were swift. Margaret Thatcher's popularity soared, and she was re-elected in 1983 with a commanding majority. In Argentina, the defeat shattered the credibility of the junta, leading to protests, the collapse of military rule, and the eventual return of democracy. For both nations, the war marked a turning point. Britain regained a sense of national pride, while Argentina entered a period of reflection and rebuilding, yet controversy and questions linger. The sinking of the Belgrano remains hotly debated. Some view it as a war crime, others as a necessary act of war. Critics on both sides questioned whether the war was worth the cost in blood and treasure. The bitterness in Argentina never fully faded, and the sovereignty dispute continues. In 2013, the people of the Falkland Islands held a referendum. An overwhelming 99.8% voted to remain under British rule. Still, Argentina has never relinquished its claim, and tensions occasionally resurface. The Falklands War, though often overshadowed by larger conflicts, stands as a stark reminder of how history, nationalism, and politics can collide over even the most remote corners of the world. It was a war fought over pride, identity, and legacy, one that tested the resolve of two nations and reshaped their futures. Today, the Falklands are peaceful, but the memorials, the veterans, and the stories ensure that this brief but intense war is not forgotten. As the credits roll, show serene shots of the islands today, sheep grazing, children in school, veterans returning for remembrance. Then a final call to action appears: subscribe for more untold war stories, leave a comment with your thoughts on the Falklands War, and don't forget to watch our other history deep dives.